Okay, Egypt lesson one, just kind of like what we talked about in class. Egypt did everything that Mesopotamia did, except they had a few more things. So if you look at this first page here, it talks about looking at the map on page 142 and 143. And basically, this question says, what positive and negatives do you see about where Egypt is? A positive one that I can see right here, it's kind of in both pictures, is they're located next to water because water did everything for them. The negative is they're kind of trapped out here on the desert. So we're going to look through this chapter here, and I'm going to read the pages, and then that way you can go back and look at how to fill out these things. So basically with lesson one, we're going to start here with the gift of the Nile. And it says right here, have you ever received the gift that was very important to you? How did it affect your life? The Nile River was so important to Egypt that 2,500 years ago, an ancient Greek historian called Egypt the gift of the Nile. So geography of Egypt. Why was the river so important? The Greek historian knew that what he was talking about. The Nile River fed the Egyptian civilization for hundreds of years. So the longest river. The Nile is 4,160 miles long, the world's longest river. It begins near the equator in Africa and flows north to the Mediterranean Sea. In the south, it churns with cataracts. A cataract is a waterfall near the sea where the Nile branches into a delta. A delta is the area near the river's mouth where the water deposits fine soil called silt. In a delta, the Nile divides into many streams. The river is called the Upper Nile in the south and the Lower Nile in the north. For centuries, heavy rains in Ethiopia caused the Nile to flood every summer, and the floods deposited rich soil along the Nile's shores. This soil is very fertile, just like Mesopotamia had fertile soil, which means it was good for growing crops. But unlike the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile River flooded at the same time every year, so the farmers could predict when to plant their crops. (148) Red land and black land. The ancient Egyptians lived in narrow bands of land on each side of the Nile. They called this region the Black Land because of the fertile soil and the floods that deposited it. The Red Land was the barren desert beyond the fertile region. Weather in Egypt was almost always the same. 8 months out of the year, sunny and hot. The 4 months of winter were sunny but cooler. Most of the region received only an inch of rain all year long, and the parts of Egypt not near the Nile were a complete desert. Isolation. The harsh desert acted like a barrier to keep out enemies, and the Mediterranean coast was swampy and lacked any good harbors. And for these reasons, the early Egyptians stayed pretty close to home. What did the floods of the Nile River provide the farmers? Well, we just talked about that it gave them good soil. Land of plenty. How did Egypt use the land around the Nile? Each year, Egyptian farmers watched for white birds called Ibiseus, which flew up from the south. When the birds arrived, the annual floodwaters would soon follow, and after the waters drained away, farmers could plant seeds into the fertile soil. Agricultural techniques. By about 2400 BC, farmers used technology to expand their farmland. Working together, they dug irrigation canals that carried river water to dry areas. They used a tool called a shadoof to spread the water across the fields, and these innovative or new techniques gave them more farmland. Egyptian crops. The Egyptians grew a large variety of foods, but they were the first to grind wheat into flour and mix the flour with yeast and water to make dough that rose into bread. And they grew vegetables like lettuce and radishes, asparagus and cucumbers, fruits like dates, figs, grapes, and watermelons. And the Egyptians also grew materials for their own clothing. They were the first to weave fibers from flax plants into a fabric called linen. Lightweight linen cloth was perfect for hot Egyptian days. Men wore linen wraps around their waist. Women wore loose sleeveless dresses, and the Egyptians also wove marsh grasses into sandals. The Egyptian houses. Egyptians built houses using bricks made from mud in the Nile mixed with chopped straw. They placed narrow windows high into the walls to reduce the bright sunlight, and Egyptians often painted the walls white to reflect the blazing heat. They wove sticks of palm trees to make the roofs, and inside wooden reed mats covered the dirt floor, and most Egyptians slept on mats covered with linen sheets, and wealthy citizens enjoyed bed frames and cushions. The Egyptian nobles had fancier homes with tree-lined courtyards for shade, and some had a pool filled with lotus blossoms and fish. Poorer Egyptians simply went to the roof to cool off after sunset, and they often cooked, ate, and even slept outside all the time. Geography shapes Egyptian life. What economic activities developed in Egypt? Egypt's economy depended on farming. However, natural resources of the area allowed the economic activities to develop too. Mining. The Egyptians wanted valuable metals that were not found in the Black Land. For example, they wanted copper to make tools and weapons. Egyptians looked for copper as early as 6000 BC, and later they learned that iron was stronger, so they sought that out as well. Ancient Egyptians also desired gold for its bright beauty, and the Egyptian word for gold was nub. And Nubia was the Egyptian name for the area of the Upper Nile that had the richest gold mines in all of Africa. Mining minerals was difficult. Veins, or long streaks of copper, iron, and bronze, were hidden inside desert mountains on the hot Sinai Peninsula east of Egypt. And even during the cool season, chipping minerals out of the rock was miserable work. Egyptians mined precious stones too, and they were probably the first in the world to mine turquoise. The Egyptians also mined lapis lazuli. These were beautiful blue stones that were used in jewelry. Fishing and hunting. The Nile had fish and other wildlife the Egyptians wanted. And to go on the river, Egyptians made lightweight rafts by binding together reeds, and they used everything from nets and harpoons to catch fish. And one ancient painting even shows a man ready to hit a catfish with a wooden hammer. More adventurous hunters speared hippopotamuses and crocodiles along the Nile, and Egyptians also captured quail with nets, and they used boomerangs to knock down flying ducks and geese. A boomerang is a curved stick that comes back whenever a person throws it. Transportation and trade. Eventually, Egyptians equipped their reed boats with sails and oars, and the Nile then became a highway for them. The river's current was super slow, so boaters used paddles to go faster whenever they traveled north on the current. And going south, they raised a sail to let the winds blow them in the direction. The Nile provided so well for the Egyptians that sometimes they had surpluses, or more goods than they needed, and they began to trade with each other. Ancient Egypt had no money, so they only exchanged goods that they either grew or they made. And this method of trade is called bartering. So the end of our lesson review is a lot like Mesopotamia. They had nice fertile soil. It was fertile because it flooded every year. They grew all kinds of things, and they were even able to grow flax, which was their own linen for clothing. They had nice mud houses. Some of them even had really elaborate houses if they were rich, with trees that they planted. And they got up and down the river by having boats that had oars and sails. So they've come a long way. That's the end of lesson 1.